This is a new section. In this section, we are going to talk about model binding and model validation. And in this first video, we're going to talk about what is model binding. First of all, we need to know what kind of problem model binding is trying to resolve. So let's actually jump into Visual Studio and go into our previous code and try to figure out what kind of problem we are having. So if we go to any places where we're trying to extract value from HTTP context object here, you see this one, we're taking the ID from the root value right, inside the request object. And there are other places where we're doing the similar thing. For example, from the delete, we're doing the same thing. We're going to the root value and take the ID from it. If we go into the HTTP put or HTTP post, we take a lot of efforts here reading the employee information from the body. So we as developers, instead of focusing our energy on implementing the business logic, we're taking a lot of energy trying to implement some technical details that should have been implemented by the framework. You see, the framework is there to eliminate this kind of work for us. The framework does the technical details, whereas developers focus our energy on implementation details of the business logic instead of the technical problems. So these technical problems where the data should be extracted from one data structure to a different data structure to provide to the developers to use. These type of work should be done by the ASP.NET Core framework. And indeed, ASP.NET Core framework offers such functionality. And this is what we call model. So let's try to define model binding. Here we are extracting data from the HTTP body. Here we're trying to extract data from the root value. And you can see a pattern here. When we try to extract data from the HTTP request into a .NET object here, we have ID here, and in the case when we post data, we have the employee object here. So these are all .NET types. And when this happens, we're trying to do model binding, but this is not exactly the model binding. What we refer to as model binding has something to do with the endpoint handler. You can see that we have the endpoint handler right over here. For the map get, we have the endpoint handler right over here. And for the post, we have the endpoint handler right here. So the best case scenario is we don't even need to do anything about the data. The data should be passed into the endpoint handler because you know that endpoint handler in ASP.NET Core is a function or a method here, right? As you see here. So, which means that it has its own parameters. And best case scenario is that ASP.NET Core should take the responsibility to extract the information from the HTTP request and feed that information through the parameters of the endpoint handler function or the endpoint handler method. And this is what we call model binding. So that's the definition. So I'm putting it on the screen here. Again, the definition is to extract data from the HTTP request to .NET objects as parameters in the endpoint. So this is what we call model binding. So now let's go on to the next topic of what are the sources of the data in the HTTP request. And we all know that we have already gone through this. We have root values from the HTTP request. We have query strings. We have headers and we have body. So those are the 4 different sources of the data where we extract data. So these 4 different sources where ASP.NET Core model binding extract data from. Now, how does ASP.NET Core actually implement the model binding process? It first look at the parameter. So let's actually try to do model binding. So let's take this as an example. Instead of using the HTTP context, we use a different signature here. So first of all, we need to provide the root template, which is the same thing as before. Let's paste this over here. Secondly, instead of using the HTTP context over here, we directly use the endpoint handler. So we expect the ID to be passed in through the handler here. So therefore, we're going to say int ID, and then I'm going to use a lambda expression, and then we're going to do whatever we need to do inside it. So by doing this, you can see that we basically skipped over the parsing here, right? The extracting and parsing here. We can do the rest of the things, and the rest of these are related to business logic. This part of the technical details is already covered by ASP.NET Core. So let's go over this again. We have a lambda expression which represents the endpoint handler, and the endpoint handler is a function or method here, and it has a parameter. So how does the ASP.NET Core work here? The ASP.NET Core looks at the endpoint handler, and it sees that it has a parameter, and then it goes into the HTTP context.request object, right? The HTTP request object, and try to find a corresponding data source. In this case, it goes into the root values and it sees it. Other places we have already talked about, if they don't see it in the root values, it could go into the query string or the headers or the body. So this is how ASP.NET Core model binding works. Again, it first look at the endpoint handler and take one parameter, and then it looks for the corresponding data inside the HTTP request object. And because of this sequence, right, it first look at the parameter and then goes to the HTTP context.request object. We are usually, when we talk about ASP.NET Core model binding, we're saying that we are binding, for example, this one. We're binding this parameter to the root value, right? Instead of the other way around. That's usually what we say. But it also makes sense, generally speaking, it makes sense to say that we're binding from the HTTP request object to the parameter, right? This is how data flows. Data flows from the HTTP request object to the lambda expression, the endpoint handler. But because how ASP.NET Core works here, it actually first look at the parameter and then looks for the source. So people usually say, you will look at many articles or documentations from Microsoft, they're saying that they're binding the parameter to the corresponding data inside the HTTP request. I just want you to be familiar with this way of expressing things. But personally, I think both ways make sense, and especially I think it makes sense to follow the flow of the data. But because this is what Microsoft and the others out there are saying, they are saying that we're binding the parameter to HTTP context or HTTP request. So let's follow this approach. We're binding from the parameter to the HTTP request. Okay, so this is the terminology here. And last but not least, let's talk about when does model binding happen. Let's jump into a diagram here. Let's try to draw a diagram. So we talk about routing. Routing is the process to map a HTTP request to a particular handler and then record that endpoint handler information in the HTTP request object, actually the HTTP context object. After that, we execute the selected endpoint, okay? So routing happens first, where it selects an endpoint, and then ASP.NET Core tries to execute the endpoint, but between these two, model binding happens. So model binding happens before the endpoint is executed. which makes sense because model binding is responsible to extract data from the HTTP request object, and only by doing so before executing the endpoint can it pass the data into the endpoint handlers as a parameter. Okay, so this is when model binding happens. All right, that's everything I want to cover. Let's just summarize very quickly. Definition of model binding, first of all, is to extract data from HTTP request to dominant objects as parameters in the endpoint handlers. Okay, so as developers, we can focus our energy on implementing the business logic instead of the technical details. So ASP.NET Core take care of that. Secondly, what are the data sources? We have root values, query strings, headers, and thirdly, we clarified about a terminology, the direction of the binding, right? So we're saying that typically people are saying we're binding from parameter to the data source, which is the HTTP request, because that's how ASP.NET Core works. ASP.NET Core look at the parameter first and then try to find the data source to bind to. All right, lastly, when does model binding happen? It happens in between these two, right? Between the routing and execution of the endpoint. And that's everything I want to talk about in this video. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I will see you in the next one.